how's it going, guys? This is Ryomrat, a photographer based in Tokyo. So there has been a trend going, and I don't know if I'm the first guy or not, but I'm taking this from a famous person, famous photographer called Grainy Days actually, where he posted a photo with a sound, and this caught my attention. If you guys know, photography according to Google is the art practice of taking and processing photographs, and if you dig deeper, it also means you're drawing
Photography.
with light in the process of recording an image on a light sensitive film back in the days when we shot with film cameras. But now if we're shooting with digital, it's more like the CMOS sensor within that digital camera. And however, we know typically photography is capturing that decisive moment, and if there was an area where it lacked, it would be not the visual, it would be the sound actually. And a couple of videos back, I made a video on Suzuki Shin's like 7 tips of improving photography, and where he sort of in one of his chapters he talked about the difference between photography and videography is that videography is basically, or cinematography or recording video is basically you're recording the flow of the time that is being like captured, while photography is you're basically cutting out that specific decisive moment. I thought hard and came up with this sort of like conclusion and realization that if I could record audio within that landscape and incorporate it into my photos, that would be awesome, wouldn't it be? And this process, I called it Photozone because no one named it. But I know it sounds lame, but I don't have an alternative right now, so I'm gonna use it until I find a better word for it. But recording photos and the audio of that landscape and sort of like mashing it together and making a new sort of series of photos. So I basically went back to Takao-san Station, and I basically back then, I think a long time ago, I shot this fantastic photo of a coffee shop near the Takao-san Station. And I, instead of like reshooting that photo, I basically instead got my tripod out and basically mounted a microphone on top of the tripod and basically recorded the audio around 20-30 seconds to get the surrounding sound. In order to sort of create photo zones, you need 3 things. One is you need a camera, either a film camera or a digital camera. If you're shooting with a film camera, it's essential that if you're shooting at night especially, you need sort of like a cable release. A cable release is basically this cable where you basically screw onto your film camera, and basically you can fire the shutter without touching the camera, because if you touch the camera, it's gonna shake because you're like opening the shutter for extended period of time. So a cable release is essential. But if you're like shooting with a digital camera, I sometimes shoot with the X-T3 or X-T4 from Fuji, you can basically use a timer function within the digital camera, and like 100% of digital cameras have some kind of timer function. Fujifilm has a 2-second delay camera firing function and also a 10-second delay shutter firing mechanism. That doesn't sound right, but sort of like a timer function, so you can basically fire the shutter without touching the camera. So I basically use that. And also in the top of that, you also need a microphone. And this is gonna get a little bit long and hectic because there's like so much information to pass on to you guys, but there are many ways of recording like audio. I mean, probably the most straightforward would be like recording audio directly onto your mirrorless camera, which I highly don't suggest doing because that's the worst case scenario, because what you call the microphone within the camera has really poor what you call how do I say recording capabilities of audio. And you guys probably hear a lot of people who shoot that way, you get this muffled sound, and it's not the most pleasant sound to hear. And this is this might go into YouTube actually, but the camera's not important when making YouTube videos. The audio is actually the most important factor when making YouTube videos, because people don't want to hear really bad audio, but the video quality is like really good. The opposite is much more important. If the audio quality is better, but the video quality is crappier, I mean, people can actually watch that movie. So I'm going a little bit off topic. So instead of like recording directly onto the mirrorless or digital cameras, sort of like audio system, a better method is basically plugging in an external microphone onto the camera, and basically when you're shooting that video or shooting something, you can basically, on top of that, it's sort of like a layer, you can basically put the audio file on there and basically syncs in automatically. That's basically the easier method of doing it. And these sort of like microphones range from really cheap to really expensive, and the major difference between the really expensive ones and the really cheaper ones is basically the cheaper ones, roughly I would say like $50 one, are basically, in Japan we call it bus power, meaning that these microphones, small shotgun microphones. So a great example would be the Rode Video Micro Deities D4. Those two are, I guess, the main microphones that a lot of people use. Don't have power to sort of power up these like microphones, but they basically use power from the camera and draws it into the microphone, and the microphone basically records the audio and sends that signal back to the camera. And I mean, there are pros and cons. What I call these like microphones are really small and compact, but they have harder time capturing like more extended range of like audio signals. So if you're like shooting a super wide, super large like area like outdoors, it might be hard to like record sound from far away, like a bird chirping like 100 meters away and stuff like that. So a step above that would be using a microphone that has power input already into that microphone. So it might be battery powered, it might be sort of like a great example is Rode Video Mic Pro, if I'm right. That uses a 9-volt battery, if I'm right. And basically what it does is these microphones that have battery capabilities basically draw that power from the battery and basically boost that signal, so you can basically capture more far away objects, maybe landscapes, or maybe if you're doing interviews, if you're like shooting someone like a couple of meters away, I mean, you can pick that sound really well. But unfortunately, those types of microphones cost roughly $300, $400, or maybe more, and that's out of my budget, so that doesn't work. And the method that I used was basically, because I can't shell out $300, $400, I went with the method of purchasing a sort of like external recorder. And external recorders, me personally, I went with a Zoom H1N. And this is sort of like a really interesting recorder. It's more like, it's hard to explain because for people who are new to like audio, I was new to audio. So external recorders, basically you record that audio externally to a sort of like a micro SD card. And what's great about this is that compared to like recording onto a camera that has a built-in amp stands for amplifier, which basically makes that audio signal stronger, the amps within these external what I call recorders, audio recorders, are far much better, and they can pick up sound really well without distorting the natural sound. It's hard to explain. I failed physics, so but what's also great about these sort of like external recorders is that you can basically record onto the what I call the micro SD that I just said, or you could basically mount this external recorder on top of your sort of like mirrorless camera, and basically there is a line out, so you can basically plug this into your mirrorless camera, and instead of like recording externally to the SD card, you can actually directly route that and record directly onto the video of that video that you're shooting. So you basically don't have to mess around with post-process when you're video editing and stuff like that, etc, etc. However, if you do that method, the sound quality will degrade actually. So in order to get the best audio sound, it's highly sort of like advisable to sort of like record onto the external SD card. Going to be like more like an audio video, unfortunately, but there's like so much to talk about external recorders. But I found that the great thing about these external recorders is that, similar to if you shoot with a mirrorless camera or digital camera, you guys know JPEG, RAWs, compressed, uncompressed, right? If you compress the image quality will degrade. If you uncompress the image quality will get better. Same for audio. If you compress the audio file, it's gonna get worse. If you uncompress the audio file, it's gonna sound so much better. And the great thing about these sort of like external recorders is that you can basically decide if you want a compressed audio file or an uncompressed audio file. There are pros and cons. If it's uncompressed, meaning that you will end up with a bigger file. It's going to take up a lot of storage. However, you're going to be able to grasp that sort of like a low tone to the high tone, So you get more, it's like you can get more dynamic range in your image, something like that, similar to photography. And you can basically choose that function. If you have an external recorder, you can go with 48K bit or 96K bit. And another great thing about these external recorders is, unlike sort of like mirrorless cameras, where you can basically actually change the audio gains, if that's the right word. If you like tweak that up, you can basically record in a louder sound. However, if you do it with a mirrorless camera, it's gonna distort the sound levels. However, these external recorders, you can basically change the gains. However, in most cases, because the files are uncompressed, you won't get that much of a distortion going on, and you get much more cleaner, like what I call audio in the final output. So that's like one of the great things of using these external recorders. And also, I forgot to mention that the biggest benefit of these external recorders is that there's a line in and line out, meaning that you can basically simultaneously plug this into your mirrorless camera, and on the other hand, you can basically plug in sort of like a headphone onto this recorder, so you can basically monitor how much sound is going into this recorder, and then you can sort of anticipate if you want to boost that signal or if you want to like lower the signal. And there's so much things you can do, but monitoring your audio is also important, because by doing so you can sort of like understand how much sound is entering in the recorder. And although you're like recording this sort of like landscapes like scene, there might be a car passing by, and you can actually hear that if you wear like headphones and stuff like that. So that's like one of the great things of having an external recorder. So hopefully I've covered everything. The H1N, I was able to snag one for roughly $100, but the H1N is actually a second gen. The first generation was called H1, which have similar functionalities, and you can buy one used on eBay for I think $30 to $50, somewhere around that range, which is a deal actually. So might be great to get one used instead of new actually. So yeah, I went too deep in the world of microphones. I'm still an amateur, so trying to like spread the knowledge to you guys. And also, this is a important fact actually. There is another method of sort of like using your smartphone as a recorder. Actually, I never tried it, so I can't vouch for you guys. But if you have an external microphone, and you can basically use a sort of like an audio cable, but you need to get like a specific one, a TRS to a TRRS. The TRRS goes into the smartphone, and the TRS goes into the microphone, and you can basically record that audio onto your like smartphone. But I never tried it, so I'm not sure how the audio would sound on a smartphone, and probably depending on the smartphone manufacturer, the sound will differ in the recording capabilities, all that. So keep that in mind. And for that, TRS and TRRS is basically a type of a cable that, if it's a TRRS, it's compatible with only smartphones. But in my case, if I'm recording from this microphone to the mirrorless camera, it 100% has to be TRS. And that's basically sort of like a lingo, or I don't know what you guys would call it, but it's like a specific standard meant to be used for cameras and microphones. Smartphones use a different like standard TRS, so keep that in mind. So after we covered microphones, the second one is not second, I mean the last but not least is the tripod actually. So basically, this is sort of like my experience, but if you're shooting a photo and then if you're like shooting audio afterwards, it's, I guess, great to have the exact same level of where you shot that photo. So if you shoot it on a tripod on a specific like height, I would highly advise putting that microphone on the exact same location. So if it's like above your eyesight, exact same location, pointing straight out, so that you can basically record all the information, all the audio coming from the sky and also from the ground actually, because if you have that microphone at a sort of like a super low area, the it's like how light reflects, the surface, something similar to that. So audio also like deflects that pavement and goes into the microphone. The farther it is, you won't get that type of noise. But if it's above eyesight or somewhere above your like height, actually, you can basically prevent that from happening. And it kind of gives that overall feel of that surrounding sound. And I personally would rather have my microphone above ground, like 1 or 2 meters above ground, instead of having it like super low. Unless if I'm like shooting like water flowing from a river or something like that, you have to go really low to capture that fine detail. But I mean, if I'm like shooting, when I was like shooting this coffee shop, I had it relatively high. I want to end this video, but it doesn't end because Photozone won't let me go because in order for this to all come into place, you got your audio, you got your camera, you have your photo. The last but not least is the video editing software. Unfortunately, or fortunately actually, like back in the days, editing software was you had to pay for that, but now there's like so many free editing softwares in the market. And the one that I use to make YouTube videos is interesting enough is DaVinci Resolve. Right now it's called DaVinci Resolve 18. This software is made by a company called Blackmagic Design. And if you're into cinematography or if you're into like video, you guys know a lot of sort of like foreign and Japanese actually filmmakers use cameras made by Blackmagic. I'm going a little bit off topic, but they also make this great software called DaVinci Resolve 18. It originally was a color grading software, so most people back in the days, if I'm right, edited in Premiere Pro, and basically when they wanted to color grade, it's like raw editing. They took that footage and put it into Blackmagic Designs, sort of like DaVinci Resolve, color graded it, and basically exported it, if I'm right. But now, 2022, or I don't know when they started it, but they started to incorporate like that video editing functionality along with the color grading functionality, and it kind of blows my mind because this software, I use it for my YouTube video, is completely free. And if you have a decent computer, I use a Core i5 11th gen computer, not fantastic at all. It's like media core, but it can edit like video all right actually. And if you're making photo zones, you won't be doing like hectic kind of like video editing stuff. You're just putting in a photo and you're just putting in the audio file, and that's basically you're cutting it out and exporting. You won't have any troubles with a decent computer. So this this might go into my YouTube channel, but basically when you guys see my YouTube channel when I'm doing photo walks, not photo walks, but when I'm like shooting photos and displaying it on the screen, there's this sort of like white canvas, and on top of that there's sort of like a photo slightly cropped in with like white borders around, and you might see this on like Instagrams and stuff like that. This is sort of like the video version of it. But in order to do that, you basically get the photo that you want to put onto that video. So this sort of like Photozone photo, the coffee shop that I shot at mttakao station. I basically drag that photo into the library, and this library is basically a library. It basically accumulates all the photos that you're gonna be using in that video. And I go to the sort of like the third edit section, and I basically, on the left side, there should be that library that you basically imported, and basically drag that into the timeline like so. And if you use Photoshop, you guys know probably layers. Layers is basically you're basically layering photos on top of photos. However, for video editing, you're layering maybe a photo or a video footage, and there's this timeline, and below that there's the audio file. And it's not a hard concept to grasp if you know how to use Photoshop. It's similar to that. So in my case, there's a video file, and on top of that there's a sort of like a photo timeline, and below that there's an audio file. There's like only 3 sections when I do it, but for this video, when I'm making photo zones, there's just the photo and audio file, and that's basically it. And I basically, oh yeah, and because the background is white, which means that there's a layer actually, so I'm basically sliding the sort of like photo on top actually, and basically I'm I think in the effect, there's a effects sort of like tab. You click on that, and on the generator, there is something called solid color. This is sort of becomes that layer. I basically put that underneath, and I click on that sort of like solid color tab, and I can basically change that background color from black to white to pink to purple if you want it that way, and it sort of makes the background white. However, the photo is still big. It's still too big actually. I can basically click on that photo, and under the on the right side there's a video tab. Actually, I can basically zoom in. In my case, I make it like 85% or so. The and basically that basically is what you guys see on my channel. So really straightforward. And below that, I basically drag in the audio file and basically crop that audio file to the designated like link that I want it to present to my viewers. So that's basically it. Actually, it's not hard. I mean, video editing, I mean, for some people it's like something out of your field, but I mean, if you know the basic principles of video editing, I mean, if you want to present your work in a video manner, I mean, this will help you a lot actually. And there might be a lot of side hustles with it in like video editing, so might be a great like skill to like master. So yeah, that's basically it actually. So I mean, Photozone, I just started it. I'm not a professional at it, so this is sort of like my first like video, my first take of it. But keep in mind that photography, the great thing about photography is you can print your work. And if you actually make a Photozone, unfortunately you cannot print this. This is basically a digital file which exists on a digital platform. You can't export it to and print it from a printer or from an inkjet printer, so that's like one of the downsides of this. But if you're presenting your work in a digital format, maybe onto YouTube or maybe some kind of content creation, this might be effective for some people. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy this video. If you have any questions or if you have any inquiries, please leave it in the area section below. I'm happy to reply. So we'll see you next time. Peace out.